something we've done for the last several years. I'm going to try to be deliberate in stirring the pot a little bit about some ideas of how we could collaborate together this year. I'm going to put forth a specific proposal of ways for we could work together as a community, and I'm going to be looking forward to getting your reactions about that as we go through this. So I see most of the names that I see in our the list that I can see are longstanding members of our community, but I do see several names that are new. So if you are new to the community, welcome. We're excited to have you. What we're going to do today is I'm going to hopefully motivate and reinforce our efforts as a community towards working towards our mission in OHDSI, which is to improve health by empowering a community to collaboratively generate the evidence that promotes better health decisions and better care. And we do spend a lot of time kind of restating our mission because we want to make sure that we're aligned to this. So if you're new to the community and this mission speaks to you, then good, you're in the right place. If you're hear this mission and think that that's off target of what you're looking to do, you're going to hear us trying to kind of keep this as a northern compass for us to move forward with. The way in which we've generally been trying to achieve that mission is through having open collaborations in various areas. We collaborate on open community data standards. That includes our work in the OMOP Common Data Model and the standardized vocabularies. We collaborate on open source development, those being the OHDSI tools that work against the OMOP Common Data Model. We collaborate in methodologic research. We collaborate in clinical evidence generation. Many people think about the OHDSI community from the perspective of our data network, or what we're really now trying to formalize as the OHDSI Evidence Network. But these are data partner organizations who have agreed to convert their data to the OMOP Common Data Model and also agreed to potentially execute studies by running OHDSI tools securely within their own environment and sharing back aggregate summary statistics. And we do that through OHDSI network studies, whereby any researcher has the opportunity to specify an analysis through a protocol and an analysis specification that can be codified using the OHDSI tools. Those tools are then downloaded by sites within our distributed network, executed, and aggregate summary statistics are shared from each of the participating data partners such that we can collaboratively interpret the results and disseminate the evidence. And this has been kind of a picture we've shown lots of times in terms of thinking about how we collaborate in broad scopes, but specifically as I've been reflecting on our progress and success for the last couple of years and where we could go together, what I recognize is that this picture, while I think is a faithful representation of how we worked, it's actually been kind of missing one important point, which is how do we actually identify and prioritize the questions that need answering? How do we prioritize the research that needs to be done, prioritize the network studies that need to be done, prioritize the work that our evidence network should be able to be done, that should be able to participate in. Right now, we, as George and I try to serve as stewards within the OHDSI Central Coordinating Center, for the most part, we want to enable you all as community members to do the work that you want to do. But one tension that creates oftentimes is that when someone tries to define what is it that OHDSI is doing, it's not actually well defined. There isn't necessarily any sort of central coordination defining what are the tasks that we're going to do. And so on the one side, it provides a great opportunity for you all to come and lead in the directions that you want. On the flip side, we've heard repeatedly for newcomers, it's hard to actually know what's going on and where can I get myself plugged in. And so for this year, I'm going to try to provide a proposal of specific areas that I'd like to see us focus on as a community that I think hopefully will resonate with many, if not all of you, but should provide us specific targets to be thinking about as our 2025 objectives. So part of the reason that we have this challenge is that we have a very large community now. There's over 4,200 collaborators within our OHDSI MS Teams tenant from all around the world. And many people come to the community with a different vested interest in what they're trying to do, what they want to accomplish, what they're trying to get out of OHDSI, as well as what they're trying to contribute. And so for those that have been participating in the community, but maybe watching from afar or newcomers, want you to understand that we encourage you to participate in whatever extent possible. What I'm going to share in terms of a proposal of areas to focus is not to be exclusionary towards what your interests and ambitions may be, but is just to provide a little bit of direction, of a grounding of things that I think we could be doing together that will help us in terms of having a common focus. So to get started with that, I'm going to start by opening up a poll everywhere and ask to hear from you as the starting point. I'll ask you to go to pollev.com/PatrickRyan800. You can scan this little QR code up here in the top. Let's see, does that make it bigger? Oh, that makes it bigger. Look at that. I didn't even know that. Learn something new every year. You can go to pollev.com/PatrickRyan800. Craig will paste that link in the chat. You can scan this QR code. But the question that I want to take a few minutes to start getting responses from you on is, what do you want OHDSI to accomplish together in 2025? And encourage you to put whatever topics or areas of interest that may come up to you. I'd like to do this, and we'll take a few minutes here to hear your responses, because as I lay out a proposal of what we could be doing, I'll be keen to see how well that actually matches up to your interest, to see whether or not there's areas of interest that you all have that we want to revise how we work, and trying to figure out where the gaps may be. And so as you're entering things, you can type in your own entry. You can also look at the responses that have been entered and upvote or downvote them as you see fit. So we'll keep this open for a little bit. I'm seeing right now we've got grow the evidence network as one area that's getting some interest. Support for new members to use OHDSI tools in research. Meaningful evidence which has impact. Things are jumping around here, which is fun and jarring at the same time. Advanced methodologic research for large-scale analyses. Cracking cancer RWE. Topics related to wellness. Moving Atlas along. Courses and support for new members. More meaningful evidence. Communicate our evidence to a broader audience. Understand the relationship and harmonization of OHDSI to FHIR. Develop vocabulary and tooling to optimize ophthalmologic research. Give you guys another couple minutes here. Do want to hear from as many of you as possible. We got data visualization tools, harmonizing procedure codes. Harmonizing medical device terminologies. Okay. All right. This is starting to slow down here in terms of responses, but thank you for your input. Just to go through the top here, we've got lots of interest from you on the call today on growing the evidence network. Support for new members to use OHDSI tools in research, meaningful evidence which has impact, and advancing methodologic research, and cracking the cancer RWE. Seems like it's a neck and neck race here of how many votes we get, but these are all good topics. So thank you for your voting and interest, and we'll come back to this at the end of the meeting here. For right now, what I have to do is I have to close that and then hit activate, and that'll stay open actually as I'm talking throughout the rest of the rest of the presentation here. Okay. So thank you for that input. As I was reflecting on things that we wanted to do, one thing that I thought a lot about was how we actually advance our evidence dissemination work. 2024 evidence dissemination was one of our priorities. We heard at the Global Symposium the progress that had been made from the Legend Type 2 Diabetes study and seeing the work that had been generated. We heard about our JACC partnership and opportunities for expanding evidence generation even further. And so I put together this calendar of events thinking specifically about, in addition to peer review publication being one mechanism for dissemination, that another common dissemination vehicle that we see people gravitate towards is through presentations at scientific congresses. So generating evidence and presenting that. And within our community, we do have overrepresentation of our informatics community, the epidemiology community, the biostatistics community, and I'd say generally underrepresentation of the clinical communities that we're aiming to generate evidence to serve. And so with that as a bit of a lens, I was trying to go through and identify what are the leading clinical conferences in the clinical areas that we may work on. For example, the American College of Cardiology or ASCO or the American Psychiatric Association, all of these annual congresses that are opportunities for researchers to share evidence that they generated. And I spent actually more time than I care to admit trying to collate all of the dates and the conferences and put them on a calendar. And what you can see on the screen here was some of the ones that I collected, and I kind of stopped after a good bit of time because I already started to get overwhelmed. And the reason I was getting overwhelmed was because pretty much at any given moment in any point of the year, there's probably an opportunity for somebody to travel somewhere to say something to some other people about some topic of interest. And I'm not actually convinced myself that much as we've talked about the challenges of peer review publication as a mechanism to disseminate evidence, I'm not convinced sitting in a room with 10 or maybe even 100 or 1,000 people and hoping that they hear the message that I share for 10 minutes is the most effective dissemination mechanism, but it's clearly one. But another reason why I got a little bit distressed by laying this out was because I recognized for our colleagues at the clinical conferences, many of those meetings are taking place in March, April, May, June, and all of those conferences, their deadlines for submitting scientific evidence to be presented was actually back in 2025. I'm sorry, 2024. In the last quarter of the year was basically the deadlines for having the opportunity to present results at many of the clinical congresses that are taking place in the first half of 2025. And that maybe reflect a little bit about how we think about our own evidence generation process within the OHDSI community and how we would want to aspire to deliver evidence outside of our community. Whereas we in the OHDSI community do have ample opportunities for, well, we could always have more, but we have many opportunities for collaboration across our community through the OHDSI Europe Symposium, which you heard our colleagues in Belgium will be hosting July 5th through 7th. We've already got on the books to save the date for our OHDSI APAC Symposium, which will be held in Shanghai, December 5th and 6th. And of course, we intend to hold an OHDSI Global Symposium sometime in the fall, and Elise is working very hard to figure out logistics for us that we'll hopefully be able to communicate quite shortly. So we've got mechanisms in the second half of the year to disseminate evidence within our community, but really if we're trying to get evidence that we generate out to decision makers, to providers, to patients, we need to be looking outside of our community. And if the reality of many of the leading academic or scientific congresses is that their cadence is to have a meeting in the first half of the year with deadlines of distributing evidence in the second or the fourth quarter of a given year, that means that we need to think about how we adjust to that reality if we want to support that dissemination mechanism. Very concretely, what I'm saying is if we want to have an impact at a Congress like ASCO for oncology, we need to be thinking about how do we generate the evidence in the first half of the year so we have an opportunity to submit it towards the end of the year. If we want to be presenting at the American College of Cardiology in March of 2026, we need to be thinking about generating the evidence for November of 2025 this year. And so that really changes kind of the cadence that at least I personally have been thinking about, and I know that many of our community thinks about, which is how do we put our cadence of evidence generation towards distributing evidence either through publications or with an aim towards things like disseminating the results through submission at the OHDSI Global Symposium, knowing that that's going to be the fall, to really kind of shifting our evidence paradigm to think about what could we do in the first half of the year to disseminate that evidence in the second half of the year. And so that's just a long rant to say, I think that there is an overwhelmingly large number of opportunities for us to focus on evidence dissemination, but it probably requires for us to think as a community differently about our strategy for working together to make sure that we have evidence in hand to meet the needs of our respective clinical subspecialties that may be the places where we want to get our evidence out to. So just as a list of some of the conferences that I mentioned there, there's a wide array of different meetings that are taking place, but I actually don't think it's the date of the meeting that actually matters as much as the date of the abstract deadlines where we actually have an opportunity to contribute the evidence. There's a handful of these that are in the early part of this year, but if those of you who are thinking about what are those new collaboration opportunities, probably getting something initiated and completed in the next month is not going to be reasonable or feasible. The other thing that I reflected a lot about is I read lots of news stories about how it seems to be particularly popular to be focused on dry January. And so those of you who know me well know that that's probably not exactly the best thing for me. But I was instead reflecting about dry January from the perspective of what's the most boring thing that we could possibly do this month. And so I was reflecting back on the work we've done as a community and even some of the presentations that I've delivered to you all, and you've all had to listen to me drone on and on. And I thought one of the ones that was probably the most boring was my detailed breakdown of a clinical guideline. And so if you'll humor me, I'm going to take a moment to talk about clinical guidelines, because I think it's probably about the driest thing we could do in a dry January to motivate our interest. So back at the OHDSI Global Symposium in 2018, we were trying to motivate why we needed to conduct our LEGEND hypertension study. And I provided a presentation where I shared the 2017 American College of Cardiology guidelines on hypertension. This is this 56-page document that had 106 recommendations outlined within the document. And one of the things that we actually talked about was less about what the specific guidelines were and more about how did they come about, these guidelines. They classified each of these recommendations in terms of their class or strength of recommendation, with class 1 being strong recommendations because the benefits far exceed the risks, and that going down to moderate and weak recommendations. But also they classified the level or quality of evidence, with level A evidence being high quality evidence from multiple randomized clinical trials. And then there being a level B, which is split between randomized evidence, and then level B NR being non-randomized evidence, and then level C being limited evidence, all the way down to level C EO, which was expert opinion. And based on this classification, they went through and outlined all of their 106 recommendations, one of them being specifically about this question of choice of initial medication. And they specifically said that their class 1 level of evidence A for use of hypertension drugs recommendation was for initiation of antihypertensive drug therapy, first-line agents that include thiazide. The first-line agents include thiazide diuretics, calcium channel blockers, ACE inhibitors, and ARBs. We highlighted that while that is indeed a recommendation, it's a pretty open-ended recommendation because, as the guideline highlights, there are actually 29 different drugs from these 5 different classes to choose from. And so that doesn't necessarily provide very explicit, direct insight between what you're supposed to do, given that you're basically saying you have the option of 29 different options available. Now, this was actually the motivation of some of the work that we had done as part of the Legend hypertension work to generate evidence to try to answer some of these evidence gaps as we saw them. And Mark Suchard was the lead author of our first paper that was in Lancet that actually provided a comprehensive comparative effectiveness safety of first-line antihypertensive drug classes as one piece of evidence that we wanted to contribute. So that was back in 2018 when we showcased the work that we did in Legend. Fast forward to 2023, and the European Society of Hypertension produced their guidelines for the management of hypertension. And so this is, so both in the US, the 2017 guidelines from before are still kind of the current guidelines at disposal, but the European guidelines had been updated just now a year and a half ago. And one of the things that's interesting to see in this European Society of Health Hypertension guidelines was the section on diuretics, where there is highlighted very lightly in green the sentence that says, yet no major difference between hydrochlorothiazide and chlorthalidone has been observed in large observational cohort study, Legend, using a database spanning from January 2001 to December 2018, with a citation of George Ripsack's, the study that George Ripsack led, which was published in JAMA Internal Medicine. And so it was good to see that some of the evidence that we generated made it into the next iteration of the guidelines. And similarly, the section that was discussed beta blockers had this sentence when discussing the merits of beta blockers to say, in one study, there was no statistically significant difference in cardiovascular outcomes between 118,000 patients receiving these beta blockers versus 267,000 receiving atenolol. And this was, in fact, the evidence that Chan had led this study that was published in Hypertension coming out of the Legend study. So it was nice to see examples of how guidelines evolved to provide more specific recommendations to patients. And some of that was really based on evidence that came from the broader community, including the work that we generated to try to support the guideline, in fact, making it into the next iteration of the guideline, which I'm proud to see that we've actually had an impact in a relatively short timeline. Now, that said, there's also some pretty kookiness that's going on. So this is actually in the American College of Cardiology. There's this article that was published just last year highlighting the fact that we have these two concurrent guidelines, 2017 ACC/AHA guideline and the 2023 European Society of Hypertension guideline. And they highlight specifically that you've got these guidelines that are supposed to be providing recommendations for the identification and management of treatment. And yet, across the pond, we have notable differences in things such as even the definition of hypertension itself, with the ACC guidelines suggesting that hypertension is defined by systolic blood pressure greater than 130 or a diastolic greater than 80, whereas the 2023 ESS guidelines suggesting that should be 140 over 90. And in the pharmacotherapy section, we can see that the US-based guidelines specifically made recommendations about the use of classes drugs, but did not include beta blockers as a recommended first-line therapy, unless with a specific additional consideration for patients with heart failure. Whereas the 2023 European guidelines specifically highlighted all of the classes drugs, inclusive of beta blockers. So I highlight this for two reasons. One is I think that if we can't actually agree to common best practices around the world, then that presents still a legitimate opportunity for evidence advancement until we actually can reach and resolve these kinds of discordant opinions about things. The second thing that I think it highlights for me is that as we as an international community try to do research, if we're going to try to do research on a topic like hypertension, but hypertension itself is actually defined differently in the US and Europe, then that means we have tremendous challenges that we need to be able to resolve and overcome as a global community. But nonetheless, it's actually this very dry, boring activity of reading the clinical guidelines that can provide us some of these insights. That clinical guideline also, the AHA guideline that we reviewed back in 2017, also had various recommendations that were still based on expert opinion. And since this is still the current clinical guideline, we can highlight the fact that there is a recommendation for pharmacotherapy that says initiation of antihypertensive drug therapy with 2 first-line agents of different classes, either as separate agents or as fixed-dose combinations, is recommended for adults with stage 2 hypertension with higher blood pressure. And this recommendation is currently, as of the current guideline, based purely on expert opinion. And in fact, the guideline goes on to provide the synopsis and concede that they couldn't identify any randomized clinical trials that actually provided support for this. However, there was anecdotal evidence of at least seeing that combination therapies seem to work. And so I would assert to you all that while the guidelines are extremely dry to read, they do provide an opportunity for us to identify priority questions. And if something is currently recommended best practice based only on some person's expert opinion, that's probably an area that we should explicitly identify as an evidence gap that we should be thinking about. How can we determine, is there something that could actually either support or refute that recommendation? Now, I just talked about hypertension because that was our first legend study. Just to point out, I'm not talking about nothing that I would talk about today is specifically about hypertension. If we switch gears to diabetes, the latest diabetes clinical guidelines from the American Diabetes Association actually came out at the end of 2024. And in fact, I think the publication is actually listed as January. So it's this month is the current clinical guidelines. And the ADA guidelines takes a slightly different tack than the AHA, but it still kind of follows some general rubric, which is they need to understand the evidence that's available, classify it based on what they believe to be the level of evidence that's there, and then use that to make recommendations to providers about the right course of action. And specifically for the ADA, when they have their grading system, they talk about level A evidence as being clear evidence that comes from well-conducted, generalizable, randomized clinical trials. Level B evidence being supportive evidence from well-conducted cohort studies. And somehow in here, they also think that a well-conducted case control study is good enough. Personally, I think Martine and I would find that to be an oxymoron, but that's probably a different topic. But this goes all the way down to poorly controlled studies and expert opinion. This is the 2025 clinical guidelines for diabetes. Also a dry read to start the year. One of the various sections is pharmacologic approaches to glycemic treatment. And they have in here this rubric that specifically highlights that probably the best thing that a diabetic patient could do would be to have healthy lifestyle behaviors, have diabetes self-management and support. But beyond that, a patient can define their goals and whether or not their goal is specifically around cardiovascular and kidney risk reduction, or whether it's achieving and maintaining weight and glycemic goals. And on the basis of subpopulations and personal preference, this guideline goes through to provide recommendations of which classes of drugs make sense. And in fact, the 2025 guidelines across the range of different scenarios, and many of them are making current recommendations of first-line therapy being a GLP-1 receptor antagonist or an SGLT2 class of drugs, which are the classes of drugs that had for some time been considered second-line or tertiary treatment, but have now evolved the guidelines to reach this point where they're being recommended for first-line treatment for a wide number of patients. Now, one of the things I want to actually specifically highlight here is that this is the 2025 guideline. ADA actually does a good job of actually issuing guidelines on an annual basis. And here in this guideline, specifically highlighting how many of the different guidelines have level A evidence, some are level E evidence, and actually many of these are level B evidence, which are effectively non-randomized studies that are actually directly informing clinical care, presenting a real opportunity for us as an OHDSI community to know that there could be a receptive audience to the evidence that we generate if we focus on the right questions. But I'll also highlight that this annual review of clinical guidelines, that this section of just pharmacologic approaches has an entire page of changes from the 2024 guidelines. So if you're a practicing clinician, of which I'm very thankful that I'm not, it seems to me almost impossible for someone to actually be able to keep up with the latest and greatest information if these very extensive multi-hundred-page documents that represent guidelines are going to have such substantial changes year on and year out. Now, beyond that, I want to actually do a little bit of a history lesson to go back to 2021. 2021 was when OHDSI issued its protocol for the Legend type 2 diabetes study that Mark led within our community. And back then, one of the things that actually drove our decision making about the Legend type 2 diabetes study was the ADA clinical guidelines. And this is the cartoon representing what was recommended as the standard of care for diabetes back in 2021, only 4 years prior to this 2025 guideline. And in this specific guideline, you can see that the picture actually does, I'll rewind back so you can see what the current picture is, this bunch of this flow chart with various arrows. And I'll show you back when we started what the picture actually looked like. It actually specifically started with a recommendation that patients should start with first-line therapy of metformin, and that it was only based on specific indicators of prior risk of cardiovascular disease and heart failure, were there differentiated recommendations about which classes of drugs you should get as a second-line treatment if metformin was not effective or tolerated. And this was quite an array of different options, suggesting that all of the different secondary and tertiary classes of drugs had their place in the armamentarium for the providers in managing diabetes. Part of why I'm highlighting this is because we developed a study based on this current clinical guideline and trying to answer evidence gaps that we saw that they also highlighted in this. And I think to a large extent, the work that the team demonstrated at the 2024 OHDSI Global Symposium demonstrates the value here. But also, I think another huge opportunity for real-world evidence is that if guidelines are changing this fast, somebody needs to be paying attention to whether real-world practice is actually keeping pace. And if it were the case that just 4 years ago, the guidelines had specific recommendations for management of disease, 4 years later, we have different recommendations for management of disease, I would assert that real-world evidence, real-world data is the only way we're going to actually be able to monitor the extent to which patients are actually concord to current clinical guidelines and the extent to which we observe patient treatment choices that are heterogeneous and whether or not those evolutions of those clinical guidelines are actually making a meaningful difference. And I think that presents a real big opportunity for us as a community. Which I think is something that is not ever going to be able to be established by randomized clinical trials alone. So just to get off of what we've previously done with Legend studies, I would actually assert, as I was starting my dry January reading clinical guidelines for the fun of it, that this is a topic that is totally universal to any clinical subspecialty we're interested in. Asia shared with me her start of her dry January reading clinical guidelines in the oncology space. And she shared with me this ASCO guideline for stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer. And here in the clinical guidelines from ASCO, they have this table of all the clinical question. What's the most effective first-line treatment option for patients based on their driver alterations? And effectively across the board, you don't have to read all the table. I'll just show the main thing is there's a column for evidence quality and a column for strength of evidence. And what you're going to see kind of across the board is that the quality of evidence that exists to support all of these critically important decisions for patients with lung cancer is low or moderate, with only a smattering of situations where it's high. And the strength of the recommendations, some of them are strong in the face of only moderate evidence, but many of them are weak in large part because we don't have confidence evidence to rely on. And so while it can be tremendously boring and a dry topic to do, I would assert that one of the biggest opportunities we have in front of us is using the clinical guidelines as a guide to help us identify what questions matter most to the current clinical community and for us to go after and tackle those evidence needs and those evidence gaps as our priority. So with that as a long-winded approach, I'm going to highlight 4 things that I'd like to see as our 4 focus areas for the year. And I'm going too slow, so I'm going to go fast through this so that we can open up a conversation. Guideline-driven evidence generation. I would like to propose as a community that you all join me in dry January and do the very boring task of reading clinical guidelines, because I think clinical guidelines can provide us with the specific direction of where we could prioritize our collective efforts as a community in 2025. I'm specifically going to be asking that we review guidelines, figure out where we could contribute. From dry January, we can move into phenotype February, and instead of just willy-nilly thinking about the problem of phenotyping, we can actually prioritize the phenotypes that we developed based on the needs of the questions that we identify from our guidelines. From there, I'd like for us to march into data fitness and focus on our evidence network, specifically focusing on answering this question of fitness for use, not in the abstract, but in the very concrete question of which of our data partners have data that's appropriate for addressing the evidence questions that we've identified this month. And from there, we can go into Analysis April, where we'll prepare our protocols and make sure that we have analysis specifications to execute studies that meet the needs of those evidence questions. We can go into Meta-Analysis May so that we can collaboratively interpret the results of our network. And then we can use June as an opportunity to reflect both on the process that we are following as a community, as well as the progress that we made in generating evidence. This puts us at the first half of the year, whereby then the second half of the year could be focused on evidence dissemination, figuring out how we package up the evidence that we've generated to get it disseminated through peer review publications, through abstracts submitted through the various deadlines of the various clinical communities we have, kind of making sure that we're actually meeting the external community where they are, rather than hoping that they'd find where we are. This also provides us the opportunity to celebrate our own work through the various collaborative opportunities we have through the OHDSI Europe Conference, the OHDSI APAC Symposium, and the OHDSI Global, once we have dates established for that. Now, I know not everybody in the OHDSI community is solely focused on evidence, though you've heard George and I say over and over again that this should be our priority. And so I want to highlight 3 other focus areas that I think can work for this because it's subservient to it. First, I want to highlight we have a lot of different opportunities to contribute evidence. I'm personally agnostic to what clinical questions we go after. I just want to make sure we're going after clinical questions that matter to patients. We do have various OHDSI work groups that do have clinical subspecialties. I really hope that they will take this call to action to review the guidelines. But you don't have to actually be in one of those work groups or have a particular focus to be able to dive into this action. And I've specifically posted on the OHDSI forums a call to action asking you all to please review the guidelines and find us evidence opportunities that we can focus on. And Oz is asking the question, are we doing this for one particular disease or any number of diseases? I'm asserting that in dry January, I want to figure out what all the opportunities are so that we can prioritize and identify what subset of those we're going to tackle together as a community. Now, to generate the evidence means we do need to focus on our data standardization activities. The 2 priorities I see to align to this is 1, we need all of your engagement in the evidence network. We need data partner organizations who've converted their data to become part of the evidence network. And we're going to use this evidence network to kick the tires of making sure that we really have a well-defined process for assessing fitness for use and use these evidence questions that we learn in dry January to be the basis of the work we're going to do. I also want to encourage all of you to become active contributors to our OHDSI standardized vocabularies. The OHDSI vocabulary team has a roadmap of what they're going to deliver in February and August, but it's quite possible that you have other vocabulary needs, and we've created a community contribution process to facilitate your ability to enter that into the vocabulary. And we'd really like to see you all take advantage of the opportunity to contribute and democratize the vocabulary work. For us to be able to generate evidence, we also need standardized tools that facilitate that process. And I would like to see our open source development work prioritized towards making sure we deliver evidence that's needed by the community. Priorities that I see, I think we need to harden Strategos and the associated Hades packages to make it easier for all of you to use as evidence generators. I think we also need to improve the packages to make sure that they are actually delivering the evidence we need for these specific evidence questions. And there's no better motivation for what we develop than actually having a motivated need that we know we're going to use it right away. And so I hope us identifying the questions will help us understand the extent to which our tools are covering the needs of our community. And aligned to that, I think we need to be thinking about the purposes of all of our tools, inclusive of Atlas, whereby we are using this a lot for our phenotype development evaluation process, and we can focus even greater in that area. And then last but not least, in terms of a fourth priority, I'd like to see us figure out how we can put emphasis towards our collaborative education, not just for evidence generators, but also for evidence consumers. And two areas to focus on there. We'd like to refresh the Book of OHDSI in 2025 to align with our current practices and put a lot more emphasis in the book on evidence generation and dissemination, not just data standardization and the journey from data to evidence. And we really want to lean into our JAC partnership to promote best practices for evidence consumers, not just preach to the choir within our community, but get the message out to the broader research community. For those of you who haven't used the Book of OHDSI as a resource, it's an online resource that you can also buy a physical copy. We celebrated 5 years back on a community call in September of last year and talked about this. But one of the things we discussed was the opportunity to improve this, given that 5 years is a lot of time in an advanced analytics space such as ours. You know, the book has a specific structure and has a defined set of chapters that are available. But Christian Reich and Sarah Seeger have graciously volunteered to lead the effort of a refresh from the great work that Martijn shepherded the first go-around, and will be establishing a pathway for everybody to make contributions that provides the opportunity to expand the book of OHDSI beyond even the initial scope that we had. Of course, the main way we get work done in our OHDSI community is our work groups. And so I appreciate and thank all of our work group leaders. My one specific ask for the work group leaders, as we've done for the several years, ask you all to define or redefine the purpose of your work group and to define some objectives and key results by the end of the month that we can post on the OHDSI website. As Craig mentioned, we'll have the work groups present on a community call in February to encourage others in the community to join you. My one extra ask for you this year is now that I'm proposing these 4 focus areas, I want each of the work groups to clearly define, are you contributing to any of these focus areas? And if so, how? It's okay if you are a work group that decides not to focus on these areas, but I'd like to see if we can, together as a community, try to get some sort of community focus in the areas so that we can drive forward on evidence generation and drive our data network to support evidence generation, drive our tools to facilitate evidence generation, and drive our collaborative education towards the pursuit of educating those that are trying to generate evidence and consume the evidence from real-world data. All right, so with that, I'm going to go back over to our poll everywhere and present and flip the screen. And I'll ask you guys to share whether or not the focus areas that I've highlighted, if there's any of these that you are interested in contributing to. And I think you're on the poll everywhere. You're only going to be able to choose one for now. But I'm really actually just interested to see on a general side if there is actually interest in any of this work from you all as a community, to see whether or not collectively we'll have interest in going after these areas. And while you're all voting, I know we have only 5 minutes left, but I'll shut up and open the floor if anybody wants to comment, react, ask questions, challenge any of the things that I've said, and open it up for kicking off the new year.
Thank you, Patrick, for the amazing presentation and whirlwind tour. And Yeah, I look forward to working on those 4 things this year.
I think you only got to pick one, George.
I picked my first one.
Uh,
Christian, do you want to say, so I know we got to had a good opportunity to catch up and violate the dry January at Treehouse Brewing last week. But do you want to share your you shared with me your enthusiasm about the Book of Odyssey. You want to just share that with the broader community?
yeah, Sarah and we love to get all on you guys and help putting this together. And I have the greatest respect to Martijn driving it the first time. I know exactly that this is a lot of herding of cats and making sure it happens and making sure that the text aligns and it's all smooth and it is as good as it is, except it's now 5 years old, so we need to give it a refresher. So yeah, I think it's one of our that differentiates us from other communities like this, that we have this community-driven cookbook, okay? How things are done and how we want to do this. And it really shows, that people are engaged and so on. So we're going to organize it and come to you and let you, I think it's going to be, so we have to refresh the chapters that exist. We may have a little bit of more information there. And so if people have desires, ideas, and so on, please step forward. But we will also reach out probably in one of these Tuesday sessions also to have a little bit of a back and forth.
Patrick, Thamir had a question earlier in the chat, I think, about the guidelines. Should people, obviously we have 2 community calls in January dedicated to this. But in terms of using your forum post, or like, how should people, after they've looked up guidelines, how do we kind of create those 2 sessions and people talking about them?
Yeah, thanks, Thabir. Yeah, so as a starting point today, what I'd ask you to do is please post on the forums. The thing that I observed is that there's just so many guidelines. It's not clear which ones people are actually prioritizing their interest in. And I think for us to have a place where we can capture the things that we're all respectively paying attention to will be useful. Ultimately, we want to be able to take that interest from the community and identify how we're going to actually prioritize the topics that we want to go after. But we want to start by trying to just canvas the community to get the ideas out there. And so I ask that you please post on the forums, and then we'll use that as the jumping off point to identify opportunities that we'll tackle this year.